Hello and welcome to China Focus. I'm Shelley Zhang. This month marks the 5th anniversary of protests that rocked Tibet back in 2008. But since then, the conditions they've been protesting have seemed to have only gotten worse. Over the past 2 years, more than 100 Tibetans have set themselves on fire in protest of oppressive communist rule. Joining us today via Skype is Kate Saunders, Communications Director for the International Campaign for Tibet.
Hello, Shelley.
Hi, Kate. Thanks for joining us. Now, this is the anniversary of the 1959 Tibetan protests is coming up on March 10th, as well as March 14th, the anniversary of the 2008 protests in Tibet. What's been happening there in the last 5 years?
The wave of protests that swept across Tibet in 2008 in March and April transformed the political landscape in Tibet. And really, this is the only period in which protests and dissent involving almost every sector of Tibetan society have been continuing. In February 2009, the stakes were raised even further with the self-immolation of a young monk called Tape in Curity Monastery in Naba in eastern Tibet. He walked out of his monastery after the Chinese authorities there cancelled a religious ceremony, set himself on fire. And this began a wave of self-immolations across Tibet. There have now been 107 Tibetans who have set fire to themselves. Most of them have died in a radical new form of protest and sacrifice.
And what do you think, could you say what's the cause of all these self-immolations?
The cause is the Chinese policies that Tibetans are finding increasingly unbearable. And in particular, there's a direct correlation between the self-immolations and Chinese oppression of religion, and its very oppressive campaign and aggressive campaign against the Dalai Lama. And although we don't know the last words of every one of the Tibetans who have set themselves on fire, we do know that almost all of them have overwhelmingly called for the Dalai Lama to be allowed to return home. Many of them have sought to indicate the religious context of their act of setting themselves on fire. Some of them have set fire to themselves outside monasteries. Some have had their hands in prayer position, and many of them have died while they were chanting prayers for the long life of the Dalai Lama. So what they're doing is something very strong and very important. They want to convey a strong message to the Beijing leadership that the Dalai Lama represents their interests and not the Chinese state. And I think that even if the Chinese government aren't concerned about the sheer number of the self-immolations, and I think they probably are, they must be concerned by the response among Tibetans to these self-immolations, because despite Beijing's attempts to set Tibetans against those who self-immolated, the overwhelming response from Tibetans to these individuals has been one of respect and compassion. And we've witnessed gatherings of thousands of Tibetans, very peaceful gatherings of Tibetans at the cremations of those who've self-immolated, chanting prayers for the Dalai Lama. So, and in these gatherings, the Tibetans have really demonstrated their intention to conform to the Dalai Lama's principle of non-violence.
Let me ask about, you mentioned Curity Monastery, where the first person set himself on fire. I know you've been spending some time with the Lama, who's the head Lama in exile of that monastery. And one of the things that the Chinese authorities have said very recently is that they have blamed that monastery, said that, because so many of the self-immolations have taken place there, they're saying the monastery is encouraging Tibetans to self-immolate. Has there been an official response to this from the Tibetan side?
I've been spending some time with Curity Rinpoche today in Brussels. He's just arrived, and he's been speaking to foreign ministry officials today in Brussels. He's at the start of a European visit hosted by the International Campaign for Tibet, and indeed he has been speaking about this. The Chinese authorities have launched a new and a much more aggressive, much more formal response to the self-immolations, in which they've been seeking to blame the Dalai Lama and to blame exile forces for so-called incitement of the self-immolations. But this only enables them to avoid taking responsibility and being accountable through their own policies. And so Curity Rinpoche today has been speaking about the importance of the Chinese authorities addressing genuine Tibetan grievances that are leading to the self-immolations, and not attempting to look at some phantom instigation from outside, which does not exist.
Well, you said they're blaming the Dalai Lama, but is that new? That's not.
You're right, that's not new. What is new, certainly in the last 2 months, has been the Chinese authorities' much more formal response to the self-immolations, in that they're taking measures to criminalize the self-immolations and anyone that they allege is associated with the self-immolations. And so what they're doing is creating a cycle, a vicious cycle of retribution against family, friends, or even onlookers to the self-immolations. And this can only worsen the situation. And we know that there's been great distress among Tibetans in Curity Rinpoche's area of Tibet, particularly about the imposition of a suspended death sentence, which will likely be commuted to a life sentence, on a senior Tibetan monk who was the Chinese authorities charged with intentional homicide for the death of another monk due to self-immolation. Now, I've spoken to individuals who know that monk who was sentenced, and they believe that he's an extremely good man. They believe that, if anything, he would have dissuaded Tibetans from setting fire to themselves. And probably all that he did was perhaps pray for somebody who had self-immolated and died. But singling individuals out for such persecution can only aggravate the situation still further. And this is in line with the authorities' response since 2008 to both the protests that broke out and also to the self-immolations. The Chinese authorities have strengthened the military build-up in Tibet, and they've also strengthened the very policies and measures that are at the root cause of the self-immolations and the protests.
What kind of response would you say the Chinese authorities should have?
A more rational response, if the Chinese authorities were to be seeking to end the self-immolations and to end the unrest. They need to give Tibetans more space to express themselves. They need to address the emergency situation in Tibetan areas and implement existing measures for creating ethnic autonomy in Tibetan areas before the situation becomes too dangerous.
Let me ask about the issue of ethnic autonomy. There's right now in Beijing, the two meetings are going on, especially the National People's Congress is supposed to be addressing the issue of ethnic tensions in the area. Do you expect any kind of proposals to come out of that meeting that would be helpful?
I think that the way in which the Chinese authorities frame these issues and the reality on the ground are two very different things. The reality is that if you look at the situation among individuals, the Tibetans in their protests have always made a very strong point of distinguishing between the Chinese people and the Chinese government. And they have stated that their opposition, their dissent, is against the Chinese authorities' policies and not the Chinese people. And in fact, levels of you might expect that after 60 years, the Tibetan people have suffered such severe oppression, dispossession, marginalization, social breakdown, and such pressure from the policies of the Beijing government that they might respond in a more hostile and aggressive way. But instead, they have stuck firmly, they've adhered firmly to the Dalai Lama's principle of non-violence. And this is also a principle that is deeply embedded in Tibetan culture. And so you have seen Tibetans and Chinese forming alliances, allegiances, educated Chinese and Tibetans acknowledging that in many ways they face the same issues of a lack of a voice, lack of freedom of expression, and also intensified military build-up and crackdown. And so in that sense, the levels of ethnic hatred are not high. I think that the concern is that in the future, the situation may exacerbate further if policies continue as they are. But right now, it does seem as though many Tibetans and many educated Chinese are finding some common ground. And that applies to religious faith too, because more and more Chinese are turning to Tibetan Buddhism and more.
So it sounds like you're more hopeful over kind of this ability of ordinary Chinese and ordinary Tibetans to get along rather than an official way to resolve ethnic tensions in the area.
I mean, there's a very powerful example recently, which is that a Chinese civil rights lawyer who was aware of the self-immolations happening in Tibet, he actually traveled to Tibetan areas, to eastern Tibet, because he wanted to find the family of one of the monks who self-immolated. And he did manage to track down the family. He wasn't able to speak to them, but he spoke to many local people in the area. And he was worried that he would be met with hostility. He was worried that people would hate him. But he came across Tibetans who were very hospitable, they were very kind, they were very helpful. And they reiterated, we don't blame the Chinese people, we understand that you're suffering too. And so he was able to go to the family home of the monk who died, to leave some money, and then he left a message with a neighbor saying that he'd left some money and he was a Chinese person who cared about what was happening in Tibet. That was a very powerful example of the sort of understanding that's being developed.
Okay, let me ask you kind of final question. Do you expect to see protests in Tibet during this later part of March, during these sensitive periods?
Of course, none of us can predict, but this is a very significant anniversary. It's not only the 5-year anniversary of the protests that swept across Tibet in 2008, but it's also the anniversary of Tibet's national uprising that took place predominantly in Lhasa in 1959. Tibetans are very well aware of the significance of the date. So it's impossible to know the outcome, but certainly Tibetans will be aware of it. And if tensions increase still further, then it's difficult to predict what the outcome will be. I think that a very important new development has been the way in which Tibetans are finding new strategies, developing new strategies to express themselves. Obviously, the self-immolations are at the extreme end of that scale. scale, but there are many Tibetans who are peacefully developing initiatives in which to preserve and protect their religious culture and identity. They're on the front line of a life and death struggle to do that, and they know that.
Thanks, Kay, for being with us today to discuss this topic.
Thank you very much, Shelley.
And for more on this and other issues in China, join us at ntd.tv. Thanks for watching.